Every battle is both a victory and a defeat. It depends which flag you fly. In every theatre of the Second World War, battles won and lost determined possession of territory, of resources, and of the strength to go on fighting. For some of the battles, it was the victory that most influenced the future course of the war. For others, it was the defeat. This is the story of the battles won and lost that decided the outcome of the greatest conflict in history. The battles of the First World War were battles of attrition, opposing armies hardly moving between lines of trenches. The battles of the Second World War were different. In this episode, we study tank battles, blitzkrieg, commando raids, amphibious landings, and mobile warfare in the desert. In August 1914, Germany attacked through Belgium. The attack failed, and the conflict turned into a war of attrition, which Germany was never going to win. In May 1940, Hitler gambled. The war in the West would end quickly, or he would follow the Kaiser into oblivion.
Hitler is very interested in invading very rapidly. It's his generals and the Wehrmacht army that is very reluctant to invade France quickly because, of course, they're thinking of the First World War and this is likely to take 4 to 5 years. So there's a lot of emotional attachment to the idea that this is the First World War, but this time Germany will win.
Plan Yellow had designed a German thrust along the lines of the opening offensive of the First World War. But Plan Yellow had fallen into the hands of the Allies, which created the opportunity for General Erich von Manstein.
Yes, France was ready to be plucked. The whole force of the Nazi might was turned toward the west. How would they strike this time? Through Alsace-Lorraine as in 1870? Through the Low Countries as in 1914? What was the 1940 model conquest?
Manstein's plan proposed an alternative route, outflanking the French defensive Maginot Line not by marching through Belgium, but by crashing through the forest of the Ardennes.
The French are expecting Germany to come in much the same direction as they did in the First World War, and this means that they're in a quandary relatively quickly because they haven't actually planned or prepared for an attack through the Ardennes forest.
First Army Group under General Biot, and including the British Expeditionary Force, faced the Belgian border. Second Army Group, General Pretola, stood on the Meuse behind the Maginot Line and centered on the old battlefield of Verdun. Between them, in a rear position, was the 6th Army, General Touchon. The defensive alignment of the Allies clearly revealed the gap that the German assault would exploit.
The French military philosophy that they're taking into this war is really concentrating on holding a defensive line, creating a stalemate on the northeastern front, and not turning to offense, which is really what they retrospectively probably should have done.
Facing them was Army Group A, General von Rundstedt. The two sides were evenly matched. The Allies had 3,000 tanks to Germany's 2,500, but the Germans had an advantage in aircraft, and troops on the ground were very similar in number. But the German victory turned that apparent parity upside down. It was crushing. The battle began on May 10th, when German parachute troops secured Dutch bridgeheads and glider-borne commandos took the Belgian fortress at Eben Amay. The 12th and 16th Armies, built around armour, crashed through the forest of the Ardennes, and the French 9th, shifting south to meet the threat, disintegrated. On May 12th, the leading German unit crossed the Meuse and stood on French soil. Within a day, the Dutch army was being ordered to fall back on the line Amsterdam, Rotterdam, Utrecht. The Netherlands was soon out of the war, and the German 12th and 16th armies, having crossed the Meuse, were threatening the Allied rear.
And for the second time in 25 years, the Allies rushed to Belgium's aid. Movie-tone cameramen shot these vivid impressions on the eve of what may well be the greatest battle in history.
Within 4 days, the Allies were falling back from Belgium. On the 17th, the French were defeated at Sedan, and their Prime Minister telephoned his British counterpart to say, "We are beaten." "It can't have happened so soon," Churchill said. But it had. The Germans were into open country, sweeping up behind the Allies.
The main criticism you can really make of the French army is that they're slow at reacting to a new situation. And this is one area where it seems the German army is faster. Some of the tank groups which move to the Channel go well beyond what they're supposed to do. They're getting orders to halt, they're getting orders to stop, to let the rest of the troops catch up, but they don't do it.
A young commander named Erwin Rommel pretended to have lost radio contact so that he did not have to check the forward surge of his 7th Panzer Division. On May 18th, he reached Cambrai before being ordered to halt. When the attack resumed, 3 commanders, Rommel in the north, Reinhardt in the center, Guderian in the south, smashed through to the coast. The Allied force had been divided. And with the 6th and 18th German armies moving forward, the Allies were being pressed on 2 fronts.
Once the Germans do break through, the French don't really counterattack. Mainly because they're in a defensive mentality whereby their idea is that the best thing to do is to plug the holes in whatever line they have, fall back, and act defensively. And this also creates further problems, and if they're creating a defensive line, they tend to spread out their tanks. Whereas if you're going to have offensive counterattack, you bunch them together, and once you've spread them out, it's actually difficult to get them back together in time to counterattack.
On May 25th, Boulogne fell. Calais 2 days later. The day after the British had begun to evacuate the forces trapped at Dunkirk. And the day that King Leopold offered the Belgian surrender. At the beginning of June, the Germans turned south, smashing through Allied resistance on the Somme. The following day, June 10th, Italy entered the war as an ally of Germany. 3 days later, German troops entered Paris.
This had been the dream of the Kaiser in the last war. Hitler achieved it.
On June the 16th, less than 6 weeks after the offensive had been launched, France sought an armistice.
The French government has capitulated. 22 years ago, a great marshal of France received the surrender of the German army. Now his former colleague, another marshal, signs abject terms of surrender for France.
We left France in June 1940 when France collapsed. And I went to England, and then I heard that de Gaulle was carrying the war beside the British. We decided to join de Gaulle.
Though Hitler himself rejected the description as a silly word, the world of warfare had learned a new term: blitzkrieg.
Hitler sent large contingents, vastly superior in training and equipment,
A country about the size of Maryland affords a new test tube for the accelerated Nazi warfare.
Blitzkrieg is a really interesting tactic because it doesn't just work tactically, it works psychologically. So, for example, everyone has this impression that the Germans had invaded France in panzers, in powerful tanks. In fact, most of the German tanks were little better than bulldozers. They weren't nearly as powerful as the French tanks that opposed them. But those tanks weren't just fueled by benzene, they were fueled by some sort of weird psychic projection. And it said, "We will defeat you."
The tactics that facilitated rapid advance were not ad hoc. They were systematic and carefully calculated. Artillery and aircraft went in first to prepare the ground for the assault. And aircraft worked in close support of the advancing columns. Spotter aircraft, the Fiesler Storch, the Junkers 88 dive bomber, and morale-busting Stuka.
Stukas dive bombed the French positions. The screaming sound they made didn't just destroy the French soldiers' bodies, it destroyed their minds. It said, we're targeting you.
And these Stukas driving made a horrible screaming noise, and we dashed amongst the sand dunes and clawed at the earth, trying to get underground. The fear is just overpowering. And I knew then that was war.
The commanders of the Anglo-French force made mistakes, and they worked with inherited mistakes that had failed to anticipate mobile, mechanized warfare.
In France, the French army manned the Maginot Line and waited. Impatient by nature, the Frenchman persuaded himself that Hitler never meant to attack. Said Hitler, the French army rotted on its feet.
The fall of France has to be seen above all as a victory. It was a victory for a bold strategic plan, grand in concept, efficient in detail, and effective in deployment, for initiative at all levels of command, and for effective weapons designed for their coordinated roles in such an offensive. The invasion of France may have been the most decisive victory ever to fail to win a war. After the fall of France, with most of Western Europe under Nazi control, Hitler turned east, invading the Soviet Union. By 1943, he faced a dilemma. The invasion of Italy was imminent. The Second Front would follow. But the greatest part of his force was still deep inside Soviet territory. Hitler looked for a decisive action that would allow him to withdraw troops to face the threat in the West.
The Battle of Kursk basically arises out of the last stages of the Battle of Stalingrad. When the Soviet winter offensive began in 1941-1942, Stalin is really overextending his reach. He's attempting to do too much, and that's exactly what happens at Stalingrad. Yes, the Sixth Army has been destroyed. Yes, the Soviet forces have driven into the Caucasus and into the eastern part of the Ukraine, but as they keep trying to attack, Manstein, the commander of Army Group South, is falling back on his centers of supply and resources. He is able to build an operational reserve, and then he is actually able to strike back against overextended Soviet forces.
If the Red Army could be dealt a hammer blow, then, and only then, could Hitler consider transferring divisions from the Eastern Front to meet the threat in the West. The ebb and flow of the fighting had created a bulge in the Russian line, a salient.
The Kursk salient is essentially named because the city of Kursk is in the middle of this bulge. And to understand it, it's a very large bulge. It's 250 kilometers north to south, and it's about 160 kilometers in depth. And the basic idea that Manstein has is, after this success, this counteroffensive against the Soviets, he sees an operational opportunity. If we could pinch off that salient, there would be an operational success there. But the window of opportunity is quite short.
And so, Operation Citadel took shape.
It's clear, too, that Hitler has massed his tanks and planes and men and thrown into this sudden onslaught just about the heaviest weight of material and manpower of any battle on the Eastern Front.
Von Manstein's Army Group South would carry the battle. Von Manstein planned for Walter Model's 9th Army with 1,000 tanks to attack from the north and Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army, 1,200 tanks, to swing from the south. They would meet at Kursk, but pinching out the Kursk salient was an obvious option.
The Soviet hasn't been taken by surprise. For weeks, to judge by their air raids in the neighborhood of Orel and elsewhere, they've been expecting a German push on the Kursk salient.
In anticipation of the attack, Stalin placed Central and Voronezh fronts under 2 able commanders, Batutin and Rokossovsky, at the mouth of the salient. Hitler delayed the Kursk offensive scheduled for May the 4th. He had an increasingly passionate, possibly desperate belief that the war would be won by the wonder weapons, and wanted more of the new heavy tanks sent to join the battle. His commanders knew that as they waited, the Soviets too were increasing their strength. Stalin's decision had been to stand on the defensive.
Some 300,000 Soviet civilians are being mobilized to build these defenses. They will dig some 9,000 kilometers of trenches. They will have anti-tank ditches and anti-tank traps. They will have underground bunkers. They will have thousands of mines per square kilometer. And they're building them on the shoulders in the north and in the south, anticipating that the Germans will attack into this.
The Great Battle opened on July the 4th, a huge coming together of armor. 900,000 German troops with 2,500 tanks faced 1,300,000 Russians with 3,000 tanks, 20,000 pieces of artillery, 6,000 anti-tank guns, and 1,000 Katyusha rocket launchers.
Солнечный, жаркий, теплый день. Дали команду. Первые мы только эшелоном шли в атаку. Как забила артиллерия, как засвистели, это, как ракета летит, за ее можно наблюдать, хвостиком она летит.
A bombardment by air and artillery began the German offensive. Engineers moved forward at night to clear minefields.
Страшно. Бомба свистит, она свистит не видно где. А как рвутся снаряды от минометов, они сильный минометный огонь. Я уже не говорю, там автоматы, там пулеметы строчили.
After smashing through the Soviet lines, the 2 great German armies would power on, join up, and trap a huge Russian force in the nipped-off salient. But that didn't happen. After 48 hours, the Germans had penetrated a little over 10 kilometers in 3 sections of the Soviet front. Hoth's formations made a strong push, forcing the Russians to send reinforcements to hold the advance. But progress slowed. By the 9th, Hoth had advanced at best little over 30 kilometers, with significant losses. On the 10th, he was obliged to bring up his reserves. In the north, Model was less successful than Hoth, his furthest advance being barely 20 kilometers. And on the 11th, Zhukov and Vasilevsky counterattacked.
Russia's reply to the opening of the attack was powerful and prompt.
On the 12th, the Soviets brought their armored reserve, the 5th and 6th Guards tank armies, to Prokhorovka. What followed was a massive clash of mechanized forces. Prokhorovskoye Poboyshki, the Russians call it. The slaughter at Prokhorovka.
It is really a material battle, and a successful one again. But the Soviets are going to lose 330 totally destroyed in Prokhorovka, and another 200 made non-operational. These are phenomenal losses, and the Germans suffer a tiny fraction of that. And why is that? Partly it is the story of the Tiger tank and the Panther tank. These new tanks have much thicker armor, they have much more powerful main armaments, and for example, the Tiger can engage the T-34, the standard Soviet tank, at far greater ranges. Therefore, it can destroy them before they're even in range. It's in some ways a battle, in some ways it's a massacre for Soviet armor.
Туман, ничего не видно, дым, и бомбят, и артиллерия, и тут и с танками. Команду не слышат. Я командую куда вправо, там влево, туда. Не слышат. Мы ногами там толкали их, ты вправо, значит, влево. Ногой я в башне сижу, водителю, значит, говорю, куда надо.
75% of the Red Army's armor and 40% of its manpower was committed to the battle. As the tanks had crashed into Prokhorovka, the Soviet West and Bryansk fronts north of that battlefield had also moved, threatening the rear of Model's army. The next day, facing a growing crisis with Allied landings in Sicily demanding reinforcement, Hitler called off Citadel.
Germans were wiped out in tens of thousands, tanks in hundreds, yet the figures in the Soviet communiques still mounted.
It's very costly to the Germans, even more costly to the Soviets. So in that sense, it's a tactical victory, you could say, for the Germans, but these things don't equal the one thing the Germans need, which is extremely high operational successes to balance out the superior Soviet production and access to manpower.
By now, only one side could rebound from such a contest. Rather than free divisions for transfer to the west, Hitler's gamble had sacrificed men and armor that he could not easily replace. Panzer General Heinz Guderian said that for Germany, Kursk was a decisive defeat.
Kursk is important, and Kursk is the end of the German initiative on the Eastern Front, but in some ways it's the end of the German initiative on the Eastern Front because the Soviets themselves realize it's in their interests to let the Germans exhaust themselves on fixed defenses before they begin a much larger counteroffensive that will carry through the rest of the summer right into the autumn, seize enormous tracts of German territory and destroy a lot of German equipment.
By July the 15th, the Central Front began to move. 2 days later, the Southwest Front advanced, and by mid-August, the battle was over. The Russians were at the outskirts of Kharkov, and the last German offensive of the Eastern Front had come to nothing. From now on, Germany would be on the defensive all the way to Berlin. The rapidity with which the Third Reich swept over and imposed the rule of occupation on such a vast part of Europe encouraged a form of warfare that had been little practiced: operations behind the lines. But the Second World War gave a real impetus to the formal organization of special operations. Units formed and trained specifically for such actions.
Churchill, as a young man, had been a war correspondent and a soldier in the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa. He'd been very impressed with the highly mobile forces of the Boer opposition. He wanted something along those lines, small raiding forces that could strike at the Germans, but without requiring massive forces. And so he ordered that these units be created. He gave them the name of the Boer units in the Boer War, and he called them commandos.
It was such units, commando units, that carried out the raid on San Lazer. It was called Operation Chariot. Concern for the safety of merchant shipping was behind the raid. Britain, so long in receipt of the bounty of its vast maritime empire, was, despite vigorous wartime efforts, dependent on imports for much of its essentials.
There were two main threats to the Atlantic convoys. One were the U-boats. That was the biggest threat.
Anti-submarine devices have improved and increased, but so have submarines. And the Allies can never have too many escort ships to hunt them and destroy them.
But behind them was the German surface fleet, and particularly their 4 major battleships.
They operated out of bases on the French coast, and importantly, from one base with one very significant feature. On the night of the 27th of March, an obsolete naval destroyer, HMS Campbelltown, and a specially created commando force attacked the naval base at San Lazer. Their objective, the dry dock, the Normandy dock, which could accommodate even the largest of German battleships. If they could decommission the facility, any Axis vessel in need of repair would be forced to make the much longer journey north. The location was problematic. Not on an open stretch of coast, but tucked into the estuary of the Loire, with narrow channels confined by shoals, making the approach to the dock easily defensible. But British intelligence learned that the most powerful German capital ship, Tirpitz, was about to join the Kriegsmarine. The plan was to ram Campbelltown into the dock gates and detonate the time-delayed explosives hidden on board, to render the dock unusable.
It was an enormously risky plan. The port itself was heavily defended. The attackers were outnumbered something like 8 to 1. The defenders had heavy coastal artillery. Even on the way there, it was risky. The task force faced danger of U-boats, and in fact, at one point, the escorts had to pull away from the Campbelltown in order to chase away a U-boat. They were also at risk from the air, from the Luftwaffe, so it was highly risky, and surprise was absolutely essential.
But the strong and clearly alert German defences rendered useless all of the small boats that had been the commandos' intended means of escape. They were forced to fight, and they did.
They managed to blow up the dock, but it came at an incredible cost. Almost 2/3 of the force that carried out the raid were either killed or captured, so it was an enormously costly operation. It did, however, have the intended effect. Tirpitz never did relocate from her base in Norway, and so the Atlantic convoys were protected from that potential threat.
Almost 1 in 4 of the raiders received some form of gallantry award, and the highest such award in the British Army, the Victoria Cross, was awarded to 5.
Many rewards for gallantry were presented by the King at a recent Buckingham Palace investiture. Commander Ryder received the award for exceptional valor and devotion in the raid on San Lazer.
Apart from achieving the immediate goals, the raid had other important effects on the war, one of which was simply to massively boost British morale. It came at a particularly dark time when Singapore had just fallen, and so it was really important from that aspect as well. But also, it outraged Hitler. He was enraged by the audacity of this attack, and he ordered the construction of 15,000 heavily armed and heavily fortified bunkers along the Atlantic coast to prevent raids of this kind in the future, which of course had the effect of drawing resources away from the Eastern Front, which was very important at that time.
The success of San Lazer added to confidence gained from amphibious actions off Norway, particularly the Vagso raid, and the British were encouraged. They planned more ambitious raids. An amphibious assault on Dieppe was approved and codenamed Jubilee.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m., General Jodl, the representative of the German High Command, and of Grand Admiral Dönitz signed the act of unconditional surrender to the Allied expeditionary forces and simultaneously to the Soviet High Command.
The war in Europe was over.
Everyone realized perfectly well that although the German war was over, the Japanese war was not.
There was only one possible outcome in the East, but the fighting continued. On the Asian mainland, a great Japanese offensive in China had been checked, and Japanese troops had evacuated Burma. In the Pacific, the steady, island-by-island approach to Japan itself was continuing.
It had been decided by the Allies that there be a sustained bombing campaign of Japan before an invasion, for obvious reasons. This is essentially an extension of the strategy in Europe. To do that, Okinawa and Iwo Jima had to be taken. They were forward staging bases, B-29s, while they had been in a position to fly over Japan before, but they could now be concentrated, and most importantly, P-51s, long-range fighters, could escort the bombers. So by getting that close to Japan, it would multiply the effect of the Allied air offensive.
The Japs had spent years fortifying Iwo Jima, for as distance goes in the Pacific, it lies right on Japan's doorstep.
More than 1,200 kilometers south of Tokyo, one of the volcano group of islands, Iwo Jima, has an area of just over 20 square kilometers. In early 1944, Major General Tadamichi Kuribayashi and the men of the 109th Division had been sent to turn Iwo Jima into an impregnable fortress and to defend it. Kuribayashi was seen off by the Emperor in person. He was not expected to return to Japan. On the morning of February 19th, the first wave of the men of the 3rd, 4th and 5th Marine Divisions landed on Iwo Jima. If their losses were too great, the Pacific strategy may have been thrown into doubt.
The Japanese had a way of making underwater swimmers strap a bomb on their head, swim underwater, and bounce their head into the ship. And we had to stand over the rail with rifles to shoot them as they were coming towards the ship.
Marines of the 4th and 5th Divisions went in towards the beaches under covering fire from their own ships, but also under heavy fire from Japanese batteries in well-concealed rocky positions on the volcanic island.
Kuribayashi's plan was to hold fire until the beach was congested with Marines and all their equipment.
Kuribayashi decided that he would dig in, he would not contest the landings. So in that sense, it was a different sort of battle. He only had 22,000 troops, and most of those were to die, but it was highly effective.
The Marines were ready for suicide banzai attacks, but these did not come. Kuribayashi, who believed them to be wasteful, had forbidden them.
Iwo Jima was a tough battle because of Mount Surabaki. They were bombarding it, but they weren't making any progress because of the tunnels that were dug there.
As the battle ground on, the Japanese grew short of food, water, and ammunition. On February 23rd, Marines reached the top of Mount Suribachi, and 6 of them hoisted the flag. And Joe Rosenthal took one of the war's most famous photographs.
Taking Mount Suribachi, of course, is now the symbol of an American flag raised so close to Japan at such great loss. So it plays well in the American narrative. The flag rising over Iwo Jima is really the American flag rising over the Asia Pacific.
The taking of Suribachi was not the end of the fight. Japanese positions held out in the north of Iwo Jima.
And it went on for a month, on 22,000 on a pinpoint island. So 3 Marine divisions, virtually the entire Marine Corps. And then they had to grind their way to the other end of the island. So that was a fight from go to woe.
In the end, the Japanese did resort to the banzai charge, finally closing the battle for Iwo Jima on March 25th.
Through the slit of a tank, one of the cameramen recorded this picture of the attack on Motoyama airfield. There goes a Jap, crawling to cover for the last time.
On the 27th, General Kurebayashi committed suicide. Taking the island had cost the Americans 6,800 dead, more than a third of the Marine Corps dead for the whole war. 216 Japanese had been captured from a garrison of 22,000. The others were killed in battle, committed suicide, or hid in the caves from which they were painstakingly prized in the years ahead. The last surrendering in 1949, when they were finally persuaded that the war was over.
We got to a place directly opposite Tobruk, a place called Syria and Lebanon. What would you expect to find there? Nothing. There was a stone, not a building, nothing. El Adam, Burr Bush, Buck Park, all these names are part of the desert, but there was nothing there. Just the name. A part of stones with a number on it.
Tobruk mattered. It was the best port for miles in either direction. And it was a key to the supply of the armies in North Africa.
So if you're thinking about the vast coastline of the Mediterranean, Tobruk is important because it has a deep water harbour. By possessing Tobruk, it meant that a military force freed itself up from having to transport its supplies, its ammunition, its fuel all the way from Tripoli. Going back the other way, it meant that if you were advancing westward from the direction of Egypt, that you could bring troops, supplies, ammunition forward. So it really lessened the reliance upon the roads as a means of conveying logistics.
The first phase of the war in North Africa had gone badly for the Italians. But things changed after they were reinforced by their allies. The Germans landed the Afrika Korps under the command of Erwin Rommel. Tobruk was held by the 9th Australian Division, General Leslie Morshead.
Meanwhile, a new flag was hoisted by the Aussies, making it perfectly clear as to whom the place now belonged.
Morshead was ordered to hold the port for 8 weeks. He held on for 5 months. At the end of March, Rommel began to move. The Afrika Korps engaged and drove back the British 2nd Armoured at Merzabrega. The Italian Brescia Division advanced on the left flank through Benghazi. The German 54th, supported on the right by the Italian Ariete, moved south of the Jebel Akhdar for Mekili, where on April 6th, the chaotic nature of the British withdrawal was highlighted by the capture of 2 generals, Neame and O'Connor. On April 11th, Rommel began to attack Tobruk, which had been reinforced by sea with the dispatch of an Australian infantry brigade and a few tanks. Churchill's decision to support the defence of Greece had weakened the Allied position in North Africa. Force W, 4 divisions strong, had been dispatched from Alexandria in March. But Morshead had organised his command effectively, and Rommel's first assaults on Tobruk were repelled. If Morshead and his garrison could hold out, that would be a victory.
Holding Tobruk was key to the outcome of the war in the desert in 1941. It split Rommel's force. He had to fight on 2 fronts, besieging the garrison as well as pushing towards the Egyptian frontier.
So long as the Royal Navy controlled the Mediterranean, Tobruk could be resupplied and defended forces rotated. The Australian 9th was relieved while the city was still besieged. Rommel was inclined to ignore Tobruk and drive on to the canal. But because the port could be resupplied and reinforced, leaving it in his rear was hardly an option. But his attack failed. at great cost.
The key to the successful defence of Tobruk was really down in many ways to the aggressive attitude of its defenders, particularly Major General Leslie Morshead. In addition to having a very strong outer line, he also pursued a policy of defence in depth. And what that really means is the soldiers went out every day, digging trenches, laying minefields, placing barbed wire, so you could build up the internal defences.
Although Tobruk has had a pretty good bashing, it still holds out. More than that, it's a real thorn in the enemy's side.
Major General Paulus, who would find unwanted fame as the defeated general at Stalingrad, arrived to review Rommel's actions and initially allowed further attempts to break through. Although Morshead proved adept at swinging his limited forces to meet threats, the Axis had, by early May, overrun his first-line perimeter defence to a depth of almost 5 kilometres. Despite the success, Paulus refused requests for the attack on Tobruk to be renewed. The defenders didn't know it at the time, but they had had a victory. The German decision to step back from Tobruk and create a defensive position at Gazala was one of those orders intercepted by Ultra and decoded at Bletchley Park. It encouraged Churchill to order Wavell, commanding the Allied force, onto the offensive. But his forces were not yet strong enough. Thrust to Sollum and Halfaya met counter-thrust, and the British were pushed back over the Egyptian border. Tobruk remained besieged, under air and ground bombardment for 241 days.
The message was, they came in the first to shoot gunning. And of course, we started running like mad. Settle down, lie down, don't run. Pressure the ground, just stay there. By running around, you make yourself a target. And we kept picking at you, don't you?
Tobruk held out. The Allies knew that Axis troops would halt at Gazala, so they began planning for the relief of the port. The first Tobruk relief operation, codenamed Brevity, was launched in mid-May. It failed. The second, Operation Battle Axe, followed in June. It also failed, which led to a change in North African command. The new British commanders began planning for a new campaign, Operation Crusader.
One of the outcomes of the experience of Brevity, of Battle Axe, is that the British start to look at the way that their forces are structured. They start to learn, particularly from their enemy, from the Germans, the way that they combine armour and artillery. You see the concept of the brigade group becoming the standard mid-level organisation for the British and Commonwealth forces in North Africa. And that brigade group is formed around 3 battalions of infantry with attached armour, with its own artillery support, so that you have a much more balanced combined arms force.
By November 41, the Allied force, reorganised as the 8th Army, outnumbered the Axis with more men, more tanks, and a 3-to-1 superiority in air power. The 8th moved from its defensive position in 2 corps. 30th, which had most of the armour and would draw the Africa Corps into battle, and 13th, which would move to and along the coast. The garrison in Tobruk was ordered to effect a breakout to coordinate and link up with the advancing troops. Whilst these British plans were being formulated, Rommel was planning a new assault on Tobruk. By chance, the British moved first, launching Crusader at 0600 on November 18th. The Tobruk breakout was to follow on the 21st. Leading the 30th Corps, the 7th Armoured Brigade advanced northwest for Tobruk. 22nd Armoured Brigade covering their left flank, followed by the 1st South Africans. 2nd New Zealand Division of the 13th Corps made its advance with the Indian 5th covering the right, advancing to Bardia. Rommel believed that Bardia would be enveloped and initially sent Afrika Korps to meet the challenge. But he soon realized where the threat lay and turned them to the relief of Sidi Rezai, where the airfield had already fallen. British armour now started to suffer badly from the panzers, and particularly from one of the most effective weapons of the war.
The Germans in particular were well served by the 88mm anti-aircraft gun. It wasn't originally designed for use against tanks, but it was a high-velocity gun which was found to be very effective once dug in at destroying the British tanks.
I remember they were losing tanks like mad to the 88s. In fact, so I watched the German 88. It fired 6 shots and burned up 5 tanks.
The toll on the Allied force was tremendous. By late on the 20th, 4th Armoured that had advanced in support of 13th Corps was below 2/3 of its original strength. But Rommel was also faltering. He was starting to run short of fuel and ammunition. The next day, 70th Division inside besieged Tobruk made the breakout.
When our big push in Libya began, the Tobrukers broke out too. Now they set out to join up with their comrades of the 8th Army, to raise the siege, to cut off Rommel and his panzers, to clear the Germans out.
The 7th Armoured, scheduled to move up in support of the breakout, had reports from patrols of enemy armour and was obliged to meet this threat. By the end of the day, the 7th had lost 130 of its 160 tanks. Rommel now switched his attack. This maneuver became the famous dash to the wire being the Libya-Egypt border.
What we need to remember at this point in time that Rommel is a very long way from his main source of supplies. So his drive to the wire really taxed his forces. It didn't manage to achieve what he wanted to do, but then given that he was now short on fuel, he was now short on ammunition, he was starting to lose tank strength through maintenance issues, he then had to start falling back.
By now, the 70th out of Tobruk had linked up with the New Zealand Division advancing parallel with the coast at El Duda. Failing to deal with this, Rommel was obliged to fall back on the defensive line he had established at Gazala. Tobruk had been relieved, and though it was ultimately an inconclusive victory, it was one that the British were happy to trumpet, their first land victory against the Axis since the war had begun.
It shows British and the Commonwealth forces are still fighting against the Germans. We're not giving up. And this is important to show to the Americans that, hey, don't write us off. We're still in this war against Hitler and Mussolini. Don't forget us. We're not a spent force just yet.
Rommel continued his withdrawal, and the operation ended when Bardia fell to the 8th Army on January 17th. While all this was happening, the war was changing in far more significant ways. Japanese aircraft had attacked Pearl Harbor. The war had become global. And Britain now had a new and very powerful ally. Every battle is both a victory and a defeat. It depends which flag you fly. In every theatre of the Second World War, battles won and lost determined possession of territory, of resources, and of the strength to go on fighting. For some of the battles, it was the victory that most influenced the future course of the war. For others, it was the defeat. This is the story of the battles won and lost that decided the outcome of the greatest conflict in history. The Second World War was conflict on an unprecedented scale. Its battles set new marks for the sheer size of forces deployed and for the power of their weapons. In this episode, we include the story of the first battle at sea, in which enemy ships never sighted each other. And we start with the largest army ever to march, when Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union. It is one of the questions that puzzles people about the Second World War. Why did Hitler attack the Soviet Union? But the answer is fairly obvious. Because he thought he could win.
This was not just some war for him, this was the war for him. He said that the enslavement of Slavic population, this Lebensraum im Osten, living space in the East, is crucial for the German nation because we do not have any resources.
He is aware that he is in a long war with the Western Allies. There's no real view to how that can be concluded. And then at the same time, if you're Hitler, you're looking at your great ideological enemy in the East, Bolshevism. So he thinks if I bring this forward and if I can destroy them in a short, sharp operation, I eliminate my last ideological rival in Europe, and I am able to access all of the raw materials I need to go on fighting this conceived of global war.
As Hitler said, this is a colossus on clay feet. We will just have to kick in the door and the whole building falls down. Well, that never happened.
The German assault on Russia, by every measure, was an astonishing success, until it stalled. From June 1941 until it was gripped by the Russian winter, the German offensive, Operation Barbarossa, was a long and victorious forward surge. And it was mighty.
This is the largest invasion in history, and it is the single most important war Germany has in the Second World War. From the 22nd of June 1941, there is never less than 75% of the German army employed anywhere but fighting in the East.
The invasion consisted of 3 million men, 600,000 vehicles, and about the same number of horses. It seems extraordinary that such an offensive could come as a surprise, but it did. Not to many people, but to the one who mattered. Joseph Stalin refused to believe that Germany would default on the non-aggression pact until the artillery opened fire.
He believes also that before there's any kind of invasion of the Soviet Union, it will be first preempted by some kind of offer from Hitler. And since no offer has ever been made, he believes he's still got time. This is a fool's errand, and he is going to receive something like 90 warnings of this impending invasion, and he will dismiss all of them.
The front, more than 2,000 kilometers of moving military, would extend to over 3,000 as the attack progressed. 151 German divisions moved. 40 divisions from Axis partners including Finland, Romania, Italy, Hungary, Slovakia, and even a Spanish volunteer division completed the order of battle. The storm broke. Drang nach Osten, the thrust to the east, on June 22nd, 1941.
These are some of the 180 million people against whom Hitler had just turned his war machine. And they fully understood what that meant. The same as for Britain and her other allies, blood, toil, tears, and sweat.
Soviet army groups were known as fronts. 7 fronts faced west. 3 German army groups carried the main weight of the assault. Group North, von Lieb, Group Center, von Bock, and Group South, von Rundstedt. Soviet command and control was in disarray. Bridges were left intact. In 24 hours, spearhead armor units had pushed the front line 80 kilometers into Soviet territory. The German plan was not particularly original or unpredictable. Group North thrust for Leningrad. Group Center, with half the German armor, drove on Minsk, aiming for Moscow, and Group South pushed through the fertile Ukraine, which was the living space, the Lebensraum, that Hitler had promised the German people.
The basic Barbarossa plan is predicated on border battles. They have set up the German army into what is essentially two armies. We have on the one hand panzer groups, mobile, highly maneuverable, very aggressive, given the lion's share of the logistic and Luftwaffe support, and then we have the rest of the German army. The objectives of the panzer groups are to break through the Soviet front, to enact large-scale encirclements, and then crush those Soviet armies defending the border. This is the Western military districts with some 2.7 million men. And the idea is, if we destroy that number of men and all the associated equipment with it, we must be able then to just advance into the rest of the country.
Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army led the charge out of Army Group Center in front of the Bryansk front, Marshal Yeremenko. The force split. Units swung north to meet 3rd Panzer Army units, General Hoth booking south. The maneuver encircled Soviet troops and formed the Bialystok and Minsk pockets, trapping the 3rd and 10th Armies, which surrendered on June 30th.
This was blitzkrieg at its best. The world gave Russia another 6 weeks.
290,000 prisoners, 2,500 tanks, and 1,500 guns fell into German hands. 3rd and 2nd Panzer Army units pressed on in a parallel advance that encircled an even larger force, creating the Smolensk pocket, which held out until August 9th, 310,000 prisoners. 1st Panzer Army and the 11th Army, both from Army Group South, had meanwhile surged together, crossing the river Bug and creating the Uman pocket, which fell on August 8th, 100,000 prisoners.
Противотанковые гранаты, связки гранат и бросали под гусеницы танков. Но это надо было уметь выдержать, когда танк на тебя наваливается в таких невероятно тяжелых условиях против танков Гудериана. А когда танки Гудериана наступали, за ними шла мотопехота.
The advance was remorseless. When Kiev fell on September 19th, 600,000 prisoners, 2,500 tanks, and 1,000 guns fell into German hands. And Guderian could now rejoin Group Center in the drive on Moscow. By the beginning of December, these victorious battles had seen almost 2 million Soviet soldiers taken into captivity, their armor and their air fleet destroyed.
Part of the secret to German success in 1941 is not their superior operational capabilities, it's the fact that the Soviets are themselves making catastrophic mistakes. So, for example, we have these two battles at the beginning. We have the Battle of Minsk and we have the Battle of Smolensk, and these are crushing defeats for the Soviets. But they are costly to the Germans. They are costly to the Germans in the single most important area.
Germany and her allies had lost, dead, wounded, or missing, almost 400,000 men, and 40% of her armor.
That means the one thing that the German army has to end the war in the east, the panzer groups, are suffering so many losses as to preclude the possibility of enacting the single thing they must do. They can win battles, they can seize ground, they can capture prisoners of war, but they can't break Soviet resistance.
The determination of the Russian soldier to defend his homeland never faltered. The immense resources of the great land empire meant that, despite huge losses, the number of Red Army divisions increased, and a new general took over command of the front. His name was Georgy Zhukov.
The result? The Germans conquered land and lost the campaign. For the Russian tactics kept the main bulk of their armies intact and made a long war inevitable instead of that quick decision the Germans sought.
Barbarossa was planned to be a quick war, but the truth is that the Germans could never reach what they had in mind, so that meant that they're trapped in the east.
The German schedule had slipped because infantry could not keep pace with the tanks, and vehicles could not advance as they wished on the bad Russian roads. Now, winter joined the battle. The chance of victory had passed. Every battle is both a victory and a defeat. In a way, the Battle of the Coral Sea was different. It was a battle that both sides could argue they had won. The Japanese, by pointing out that the American fleet had been forced to retire. The Americans, by observing that the battle had forced Japan to indefinitely postpone its proposed invasion of New Guinea. It was also a battle that is indelibly written into the history of naval warfare. The first battle between carriers.
The aircraft carrier, kingpin of the Pacific Naval War. A war in which aircraft, whether land-based or carrier-borne, have dominated the sea.
The Dutch East Indies had surrendered on March 9th, the day after the first Japanese troops had landed on New Guinea. Their intention of reaching the capital, Port Moresby, overland had been frustrated by stubborn Australian resistance.
Japanese success in their advance on Port Moresby would have brought the war right up to and almost certainly into Australia. So these boys who have beaten the Japs and driven them right back across the mountains and down to Buna have done very well indeed.
Intercepted Japanese cables made it clear that the plan was now to take Moresby from the sea, sailing from Rabaul to approach the target from the south.
They had broken the Japanese codes. They knew the Japanese were moving towards Port Moresby. They knew the intention was to capture Port Moresby, and they knew that the Japanese transport ships would be accompanied by carriers. They didn't know how many, they didn't know which carriers, but they rightly assumed that the Japanese wouldn't just send transport ships unescorted. And the Americans moved to counter that by shifting carriers of their own into the area.
Admiral Frank J. Fletcher, flying his flag aboard the carrier Yorktown, was ordered by the man with overall command of the Pacific Theatre, Admiral Chester Nimitz, to rendezvous with the carrier Lexington and assume command of both carriers and their task forces.
Nimitz had a much smaller fleet than the enemy, and he was determined to use it. Where? The Coral Sea.
The rendezvous happened on May 1st, 1942. On May the 4th, the Port Moresby invasion force sailed from Rabaul. The main Japanese strike force, assembled round the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, entered the Coral Sea on May 5th, sailing towards the invasion fleet whose escort included the carrier Shoho. Warfare with which no one was familiar, for no one had experienced it, now entered the pages of military history.
One of the important things in the pre-war period was the Americans had really throughout the 1930s done a lot of experimentation at sea with their carrier aircraft and their aircraft carriers to really understand the capabilities that they could unleash. And they had developed techniques for long-range surveillance, long-range attack. This was mirrored to a lesser extent by the Japanese as well, so that was an important element. Battle of the Coral Sea is a battle that contains a lot of firsts in terms of it was the first battle where ships hadn't seen each other in the conduct of that battle.
Though shipborne radar could register incoming aircraft, it was not effective in scanning distances across the sea. Without such projected vision or any of the other technologies of today to reveal the position and purpose of an opposing fleet, both Japanese and American forces were obliged to rely on reconnaissance aircraft spotting the quarry and reporting its position.
It's a vast area. They had very limited reconnaissance ability. It was basically aircraft searching for the enemy. And then when you've worked out where they were, having the available resources to strike at them.
This was before the days of GPS, so the aircraft was estimating positions. Cloud cover could obscure formations.
The weather was worsening. Apparently flying in concentrated formation on a general bearing line, it appears the Japanese planes on their outward flight passed over the Allied carriers without seeing them.
B-17s flying out of Australia located Shoho on the 6th, but failed to hit their target. But the sighting was enough to convince Fletcher that the invasion fleet was making for the Jomard Passage, a channel between New Guinea and the small Louisiade archipelago. He set course. Admiral Inouye, in overall command of the Japanese 4th Fleet, countered by ordering the invasion force to turn away from the Jomard Passage until Admiral Takagi's strike force could deal with Fletcher. On May 7th, aircraft from Takagi's strike force scored the first hit, crippling the oiler Neosho. Fletcher sent a mixed American-Australian cruiser squadron to meet the invasion fleet at the passage, which distracted Inouye from what Fletcher was doing with his carriers. Aircraft from one of them, Lexington, spotted the carrier Shoho and sank her. Late in the afternoon, Japanese aircraft launched against the American carriers, but failed to find them.
On their return, they were attacked by TF-17 and were shot down.
27 went on the sortie, only 6 returned. By midnight, Inouye's situation, 1 carrier sunk, more than 20 aircraft lost, forced him to postpone the invasion for 2 days. On the morning of the 8th, the decisive phase of the battle arrived. The 2 carrier forces located each other within 6 minutes. The US reporting the Japanese at 08:15, the Japanese citing their enemy at 08:22.
The thing to bear in mind about the Battle of the Coral Sea was that both admirals were faced with often the requirement to make a split-second decision about when to launch a carrier strike package, in which direction, and so on. Really on the base of incomplete information, incomplete data about where the location is and composition.
The first American attack was launched just before 11 and succeeded in the first wave in damaging Shokaku, which, unable to launch or recover her planes, was forced to withdraw. The Japanese attack on Lexington and Yorktown went in about 20 minutes after the Americans had first launched. Japanese aircraft located and torpedoed the Lexington, which was forced to withdraw and was later abandoned.
Admiral Sherman was reported to be the last man to leave the Lexington before she sank.
Our country can well be proud of the performance of the officers and men of the Lexington. This is an air war, and there's nothing that will stop a determined air attack. The traditions of the Lexington will live on. She was a grand ship. Those of our men who failed to return, the world will not forget.
At the end of the battle, the Americans had lost the Lexington, had the Yorktown damaged, and so Admiral Fletcher signalled to General MacArthur that he had to withdraw. At the same time, the Japanese, which had lost 1 small carrier and another damaged, had decided to do exactly the same thing. In many respects, that could be seen as a draw, but it was firmly a victory for the Americans. For the first time, the Japanese juggernaut had been stopped, and that was a huge thing.
On the 20th of January 1942, Japanese troops entering from neutral and then forcibly allied Thailand invaded Burma, now Myanmar, which was part of the British Empire and stood on the road to that empire's brightest jewel, India. By May 20th, British forces had been pushed back across the border into India, and nationalist Chinese troops operating in support of the British had withdrawn across their frontier.
The British retreat was agonising. It was carried out over hundreds of miles of largely difficult terrain, in often terrible weather, on roads clogged with hordes of refugees, and most of the equipment had to be left behind. So at the end of 1942, which is the eve of the Arakan campaign, the Japanese are occupying most of Burma.
The Japanese would continue to occupy Burma until August 1945. And this first offensive, the Arakan offensive, would not turn the tide. This was a battle that the Japanese won.
War report from Burma, where after a fresh Japanese attack, our troops have been grimly holding on to their new positions on the Arakan front. War on the Arakan front is on a comparatively small scale at present, and it may not assume bigger proportions till after the monsoon. But it's of very great importance just the same.
The 14th Indian Division, the longest-serving unit of any in the British Army in the entire war, would advance into the Arakan, now Rakhine State, across the border with India. This was principally diversionary. The main attack would be an amphibious assault on Aikab. But no sooner had they started to prepare for the plan, they had to abandon it. There were not enough landing craft. While the British developed a new strategy, the Japanese abandoned theirs. They had been instructed by Tokyo to prepare a three-pronged advance into India, but consideration of the terrain and their resources caused them to reject the order. By November, General Irwin, commanding the British forces, had a new plan. He had built up a supply depot at Cox's Bazar, from which the Indian 14th was to advance down the thinly defended Mayu Peninsula.
What he wanted to do was carry out a limited advance of about 150 kilometres down the Mayu Peninsula to the island of Akyab in the coastal province of Arakan, which abutted India, and therefore the lines of communication would be short for the British and long for the Japanese. Akyab was important because there was an airfield there from which British bombers could reach Rangoon, and that figured in British plans for the reconquest of Burma.
Rain held up the start of the offensive, and the 14th did not begin its advance until mid-December, 3 months after the first proposed start date. The Japanese fell back to a defensive position, the Maungdaw-Butidong line. It fell after only a day, and the Indian Division advanced in 2 columns. One brigade following the east bank of the Mayu River. This brigade was checked at Ratedong, and across the mouth of the Mayu, assaults on Dunbaik were similarly repulsed. Here, the attackers encountered a well-prepared defence, with bunkers that withstood mortar and artillery fire. The British called up tanks to deal with the bunkers, but the Japanese knew that their 55th Division was en route to reinforce and relieve them. Attacks, supported by the newly arrived tanks, went in at the start of February, but these failed in the face of stubborn defence that held on until the new troops entered the battle. The Japanese 55th, under General Roga, began its attack on March 7th, first targeting the brigade facing Ratedong, which was obliged to retire. The 55th crossed the Mayu on March 24th and was now pressing on all elements of the British force, which began to pull back.
Another dispiriting retreat in which a lot of the equipment had to be left behind. And this Arakan offensive, which was intended in part to raise morale after the catastrophic retreat in 1942 from Burma, really didn't do anything at all. If anything, morale plummeted further.
On April 15th, the man who would ultimately lead his troops to victory in Burma, Bill Slim, assumed command of all troops in the Arakan.
The Japanese is a tough enemy, and much must be done before he will admit defeat.
By mid-May, the Maungdaw-Butidong line was back in Japanese hands, and shortly afterwards the British were virtually back at their start points.
The campaign cost the British about 5,000 men, the Japanese about 3,000, but a lot of those were lost to disease. It showed the need for better training and, above all, the need to create esprit, morale, a sense of optimism and confidence. And these things happen in large part when General Slim takes over what is the 14th Army in August 1943.
He knew that we cannot sit on the frontier all the time. We have to go. This feeling of the withdrawal from Burma was taken as a personal touching point. And the feeling was that he must get a chance to at least settle with the Japanese that they are no better than us.
Arakan may have been a failed campaign, but the appointment of Slim and reorganization of the army that resulted would finally turn the tide, removing the Japanese threat to India and ultimately driving them out of Burma. With huge forces involved on the Eastern Front after Barbarossa, it is easy to class the fighting in North Africa as a sideshow. It was not. Control of the North African littoral meant control of the Mediterranean, and ultimately the Suez Canal, the Persian Gulf, and oil. At the beginning of 1942, in order to secure this important asset, Erwin Rommel was on the move. On January 19th, 2 transports had landed 45 tanks at Benghazi. This gave him almost 230 tanks. He was facing 150 British, but, as usual, British armour was widely dispersed. The 4th Indian was holding Benghazi, which Rommel had evacuated as soon as the freighter had unloaded, and the British 7th Armoured was refitting in Tobruk.
Rommel was falling back on his supply lines, so as he withdrew, his ability to supply himself got better, that his forces were reinforced, and so once he felt himself there, then able to recommence the offensive, the British were not in a particularly strong position. They now were at the far end of their own supply line, their forces were strung out. The overall position for the British forces in North Africa was quite weak.
The war in the desert has been a heartbreaking business for commander and troops. The end of the story remains yet to be told.
On January 21st, Rommel attacked. He had 3 Afrika Corps and 7 Italian divisions. Mirza Brega quickly fell to the 21st Panzer Division, with 15th Panzer on its right sweeping the British out of Wadi Faraig. The 2 divisions converged on Agedabia, which fell on the 22nd, with part of the British 1st Armoured trapped at Antalat and losing 70 of its tanks. By the 25th, the offensive had taken Missus and 1st Armoured had lost more tanks. Rommel now turned towards Benghazi. On the 27th of January, Rommel ordered part of his force to hook towards Mekili. British forces countered by moving forces to support Mekili. But Rommel's action had been a feint, which the British had swallowed, exposing Benghazi.
At the time, Rommel served in some ways as an excuse for the British forces. Why are we getting defeated? It's because we're fighting a Superman, not because our tactics are poor, our equipment's poor, our leadership hasn't quite got its act together.
Benghazi fell on the 29th, the Indian 4th doing well to extricate itself from the trap and take part in the withdrawal to the Gazala line that those involved dubbed the Gazala Gallop.
And they said, every man for himself. There was nobody to give you orders. You had to think for yourself. Nobody was there to take control. We were in absolute disarray.
The 8th Army developed a strong defensive position at the Gazala line, where Rommel, almost out of fuel and now facing the British in numbers, called a halt.
Gazala was dug in. Not going a step back, he stand there and fight. Polish, New Zealanders, Australians, South Africans, Indians, Free French. That was our line as Gazala.
Rommel's dash, his tactics, his self-belief had produced a smashing victory.
The German forces were again rampant. The British had been forced to fall back, and Rommel now was reinforced, had greater strength than he had previously, and there's almost a sense of desperation in some regard.
But a new British commander, General Montgomery, did not panic. Rommel's dash had cost him dearly in materiel and fuel. And when Montgomery, with substantially built-up forces, launched his offensive, it was clear that the balance in North Africa had tipped decisively. Montgomery launched his offensive in North Africa in October, and the first American troops landed there in November. When the two forces linked, North Africa was secured, and Allied planning turned to the European continent.
I cannot go farther today than to say that it is very probable there will be heavy fighting in the Mediterranean and elsewhere before the leaves of autumn fall.
At the Casablanca conference, it was decided to take Sicily before advancing on to the Italian peninsula and further on to the mainland of Europe. It was to be called Operation Husky. It was agreed that two armies, Patton's US 7th and Montgomery's British 8th, under Eisenhower as Supreme Commander, would land side by side on the south and southeast coasts of Sicily. The island was defended by the Italian 6th Army under General Guzzoni. The 6th included 2 crack German divisions, a garrison of 230,000 men to be opposed by 115,000 British and Empire and 66,000 American troops.
In the original landings in North Africa, more than 500 transports were convoyed. For the invasion of Sicily, the number is unknown, but the landing craft were on time to the minute.
On the 10th of July, troops began to land. British forces along the southeastern corner of the island, and west of them, on the southern coast, the Americans. The landings were preceded by an airborne force, but that went poorly, with parachute troops scattered and unable to consolidate positions. And those of the glider force 69, released too soon, fell into the sea. The amphibious landings went well, partly because Guzzoni planned to allow the landings, draw the invaders into Sicily's difficult terrain, and then counterattack.
While some men waded ashore, others had the pleasure of landing in ducks. Ducks, of course, are the famous amphibians, half landing craft, half lorry.
The American 1st and 45th came under counterattack from a force that included the Hermann Goering Panzer Division. But beat this off, and the move inland began. The British were to move up the east coast for Messina to cut off Axis retreat. Patton would move west and north, protecting Montgomery's flank. But the advance through the island turned into an undeclared race between the two forces, to be first to reach Messina. By the 23rd, Patton had reached Marsala on the western point of the island and was driving for the capital, Palermo, which fell the same day.
Town after town had quickly fallen not only to the 8th, but to the Canadians and the Americans on the left flank as well. The overrunning of Sicily was rapidly becoming an accomplished fact.
2 days after the fall of Palermo, the fascist Grand Council in Rome arrested Il Duce Benito Mussolini, who had been leading Italy since 1922.
German paratroops rescued him from captivity in Italy, and a German plane flew him to Hitler's headquarters.
The main weight of Axis resistance was now being felt in the east as the defenders became compressed, falling back on Messina and escaping to the mainland. On August 3rd, Italian formations began their evacuation. The German divisions being deployed as the rear guard in front of Messina. American forces now executed 2 hooking operations to leapfrog along the north coast. After the second, on August 11th, the Germans began to embark from Messina. British troops had by now bypassed Mount Etna and were also closing on the vital port. American troops entered Messina on August 17th. It had taken a little over 5 weeks for the island to fall, and that was a battle won. Hitler, in response to Mussolini's fall, had ordered new divisions into northern Italy, and joining them in the fight for the peninsula would be the divisions from Sicily. For by the time the Americans entered Messina, the town was empty of enemy troops. They had escaped, and that too was a sort of victory.
Well, finally, let's look across with the Allied troops to Italy. The Germans' so-called Dunkirk was made across only 2 or 3 miles of sea. By the same token, that's all that separates our forces in Sicily from Axis mainland. A point worth noting by the Axis.
There have been countless battles, but those in the category of truly decisive are relatively few. Those that can be said to have held history on the battlefield and watched it pivot on the outcome. By 1944, the Axis powers, so manifestly unable to compete with the industrial output and manpower resources of the Allies, were bound to lose the war. But how and when they lost was in dispute. Planning for the Second Front had been underway since April 1943.
The Germans were waiting, and the Allies were trying to be sure that they had the resources and they could achieve the surprise they needed. The big question for both sides was, where were they going to land, and how are the Germans going to deal with the landing?
Yes, these are the principal Allied leaders responsible for planning and directing that grand assault by British and American forces, which everyone hopes may prove to be the knockout blow.
Their work involved masses of men and material and depended on secrecy. All sorts of deceptions were employed to encourage German belief that the invasion would attack the Channel ports or the Somme estuary. For every bomb dropped on Normandy, 3 were dropped elsewhere.
There were more than one choice for the landings in France. Normandy, in fact, wasn't the nearest place to the United Kingdom ports, but it had certain advantages. The peninsula was viewed as being something that could be taken over. There was the port of Cherbourg, which was viewed as being potentially able to be used as a major port for bringing in supplies. So it was a whole raft of factors which combined to make it the best place to go.
The greater part of the south coast region of England, to a depth of 16 kilometres, was declared a military zone. Villages were evacuated and the assault formations practiced for the invasion.
This is just one incident in recent United States Army invasion exercises. Stern preparations for the grand assault upon Europe.
Behind them, the follow-up assault forces were encamped.
We were just waiting, loading and unloading. When we started to load tanks, it's when we said, this is it. There wasn't anything mentioned as far as going for an invasion, but there was a lot of ships.
I was amazed at the efficiency of it all. We were told which number landing craft we would be on, So we were going down hundreds and hundreds of vehicles. They said, oh, you know, you're on landing craft 59. I had no hope of that. In fact, as we got there, in comes landing craft 59. It was quite extraordinarily efficient.
Eisenhower, in Supreme Command, had an Anglo-American team of meteorologists to advise him, and they warned against the 5th of June, the original date, but gave the go-ahead for the 6th. So Eisenhower gave the order for the invasion. The order was headed, "The tide has turned." "I hope to God," Eisenhower said, "I know what I'm doing." Facing the invasion in overall command was von Rundstedt. In command of the forces opposing the landing, Army Group B was Erwin Rommel. Though on D-Day itself, Rommel was absent on leave. It was his wife's birthday. The Germans had less tanks for the defense of France in 1944 than they had marshalled for its conquest in 1940. But they had the fortified Atlantic Wall, which had been Hitler's idea, and which extended over 2,000 kilometers and boasted 12,000 bunkers.
Rommel and von Rundstedt disagreed about how to use these emplacements. Nobody knows who won the argument, but we do know the result.
The invasion armada comprised 700 warships. Their role was both air defense and shore bombardment. 2,700 ships supported the landing. They carried the supplies, the reinforcements, and the infrastructure that would make the landing sustainable. Above them, the Allied air forces flew thousands of aircraft. The operational radius of the Spitfire had been a decisive factor in picking the landing zone. The Germans could meet the Allied aircraft with only 170 serviceable machines.
If you have air superiority and you're conducting a battle on land, you have a tremendous advantage over your opponent.
21st Army Group, General Montgomery, sailed from ports along the British coast, assembling an immense armada, from departure points scattered from Cardiff in the west to Felixstowe in the east.
5,000 ships, all gathering together to make the invasion into Normandy. It was a sight to see, you know, on the horizon, seeing all these ships. They look like little dots getting bigger and bigger and then merging into Normandy Beach.
The invaders landed on a 90-kilometer-plus stretch of 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. The U.S. First Army, General Bradley, landing on Utah and Omaha beaches. The British Second Army, General Dempsey, landing on Gold, Juno, and Sword. The U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne landed behind Utah, the British 6th Airborne behind Sword, to guard the exposed eastern flank of the British. It was calculated that of the airborne troops dropped on the night of June 6th, up to 75% landing at the wrong locations took no part in the early fighting.
The lesson was driven home, but more navigation aids were badly needed. That gliders must be landed at slow speeds. That some type of air brake was necessary to decrease the rate of descent of gliders going into small fields.
The Germans, in anticipation of an airborne landing, had flooded fields into which the paratroopers splashed. Rommel had 34 divisions opposing the landing, but many were facing the wrong way. Most were under strength, and some were feeble units comprising exclusively men with stomach complaints. From dawn, 5 Allied divisions came ashore. The first, the US 4th Infantry Division, landed 1,800 meters from its target due to a strong current, But fortuitously, that swept it to a weakly defended position. The 4th landed 23,000 men on D-Day and took only 197 casualties. It was a different story on Omaha.
And we couldn't hit Omaha Beach in its entirety. So we had to lower the ramp as much as we can, and everybody had to go into the water. A lot of the people with gear went down, and some of them perished.
Omaha Beach was dominated by cliffs, from which for much of the day the US 1st and 29th Divisions were pinned by intense fire. The swimming tanks had been launched prematurely, and many foundered and were swamped, leaving the infantry without cover. By day's end, 55,000 had been landed, but at a cost of more than 4,600 casualties. The 3rd beach, left to right, was Gold, where the British 50th Division landed, supported by the 8th Armoured Brigade. 3rd Canadian Division landed on Juno, where it met particular difficulty with underwater obstacles and rough water. By nightfall, it had made contact with the British 50th on its right. The final beach was Sword, where the British 3rd Division landed successfully. The perhaps inevitable general confusion, the mass of men and machines, and the contrasting levels of success created an opportunity for the defenders, initially wrong-footed and slow to respond, to redeploy.
The Germans were caught by surprise by the actual timing of the attack, and bear in mind that they weren't sure where the Allies would come ashore, or whether they would let the Allies come ashore in sufficient numbers and then attempt to have a mass attack, particularly using their concentrated armour.
The 21st Panzer Division took a firm grip on Caen, denying it to the Allies, for whom it had been a D-Day objective. As June 6th wore on, units began to extend the perimeter away from the beaches, short, and in some places well short, of the proposed target line, but beginning to move into the villages on or behind the coast.
The advance continues. It means hard fighting, as the Germans are desperately trying to delay the advance while they bring up adequate reinforcements. Every day brings news of fresh Nazi troop concentrations, but every day our strength is being built up too. This is only a beginning.
It was late afternoon before Hitler gave permission for the deployment of 2 panzer divisions that had been held in reserve. At the end of June the 6th, he was still not fully convinced that the Normandy landing was the real invasion rather than a feint. But it was no feint.
Within 24 hours, it was clear that they had got ashore, got far enough inland, consolidated sufficiently that they had a basis to keep going.
The battle was not yet won, but it was beyond doubt a battle that could not now be lost.
D-Day meant that the Germans' days were absolutely numbered.
Battles won and lost that decided the outcome of the greatest conflict in history. A war that reached every continent and touched every sort of terrain, demanded every sort of strategy. In this episode, we examine battles fought at sea and in the jungle, in city streets, in invasions from the air, and retreats from the land.
Spring in Paris, over the Eiffel Tower, over the cities and towns of Europe hangs a pall of fear and death.
The German invasion of France could hardly have gone better for the Germans.
The German blitzkrieg against Western Europe opens on the 10th of May 1940, and within a fortnight,
The British and French and Belgian armies are defeated. They're withdrawing to the Channel coast. It looks as if the Second World War in the West will be over literally within weeks.
The Wehrmacht advance was remorseless. Army Group A, in the center of the offensive, wheeled towards the coast, pushing the French First Army and the British Expeditionary Force towards the sea with the finesse of a sheepdog. Pressing from the north, von Bock's Army Group B further penned the Allied force. And soon, 3 German armies, von Kluge's 4th, von Kuchler's 18th, and von Reichenau's 6th, were moving in for what must have been the coup de grace. On the 4th of June, German troops entered the port of Dunkirk. But they did not defeat and imprison the hundreds of thousands of troops that they had penned there. And though there are solid reasons why they did not, what happened between May 23rd and June 4th must, albeit with hindsight, be classed as a German mistake with quite significant consequences. By the 23rd of May, the Belgian army had been isolated and the British and First French forced against the sea. Von Rundstedt, commanding Army Group A, issued what has famously become known as the stop order.
The Germans have been fighting for 3 weeks, invading Western Europe. Their forces are exhausted. So the German generals, and not as many people think, Hitler, ordered them to stop on the perimeter of the Dunkirk beaches. So in effect, the Germans hand the Western Allies a few days' grace.
So why did von Rundstedt and Hitler halt their smashing offensive? The panzer divisions had been reduced by 30% in the blitzkrieg that had brought them to the Channel. And the bulk of the French military machine lay undefeated, as indeed did the greater part of France.
The Germans were concerned about the potential for an Allied counterattack. And they're fighting an army which basically won the First World War. So the Germans are concerned that their enemy is giving in too easily. So yeah, there was a very sensible prudence on the part of the German commanders, who also knew that their own troops were disorganized by success.
When Hitler visited von Rundstedt, his acceptance of the stop order was made easier by the assurances of Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, who agitated for and guaranteed the success of leaving it to his Luftwaffe to finish off the trapped Allied troops.
The country around Dunkirk is not suitable for armoured warfare. It's flat, but it's cut up by canals and drainage ditches. In fact, it's very similar to the fighting in the First World War in Flanders, which the senior commanders on both sides, including Hitler, remembered from 20 years before.
On the day that Hitler and Göring made their plans, the British commander, Lord Gort, took a unilateral decision. He would not risk losing his entire command by participating in General Weygand's proposed and wildly optimistic offensive, which imagined a breakout to link up with forces further south. Gort decided instead to withdraw the British Expeditionary Force on Dunkirk, from which they could be evacuated, to fight another day. That evacuation, Operation Dynamo, would begin on May 26th. Gort's was not the only unilateral decision of the unravelling alliance. On May 27th, without consulting his allies, King Leopold of Belgium offered his surrender to the Germans. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, who had been alerted as early as May 20th of the possible need for an evacuation, had brought together a large and decidedly motley collection of vessels with which to carry off the troops assembling at Dunkirk.
British ships, cruisers, destroyers, yachts, paddle boats, anything that could float, for the British were determined to save their men.
The shortest route had to be abandoned when Calais fell, and ships would have been within range of the Calais shore batteries. The second, Route X, was vulnerable to unswept mines. And so, the longest passage, north to the Quinte Buoy, west to the Goodwin Sands lightship, and south to Dover, a journey of 160 kilometers, was chosen of necessity. As it became clear what was happening, the Luftwaffe's action against the evacuation intensified. Which spread the panic to the civilian population.
Men, women and children with bags dragging little trucks. The children weren't talking or playing, all with vacant expressions, just looking straight ahead.
The pullback on Dunkirk was not a rout. Beginning on the 26th, the forces conducted an orderly, phased withdrawal to a 25-kilometre perimeter, defining a pocket 10 to 12 kilometres deep. The BEF disabled its equipment, spiked and abandoned its guns, and fell back. Had it not been for this discipline, had there been panic, what happened at Dunkirk would not have been possible. There, the efficient evacuation was underway. 25,000 men had been taken off by the end of the second day of the operation. By May 31st, the day of the largest total taken off, the figure had risen to 68,014.
The harbour full of sunken ships, and at the quayside I could see somebody running in front of me. I could see him running, and he was running, and I thought, oh, that ship's got smoke coming out of the funnel, so I ran like mad as well, and it was just pulling away from the quayside, and I managed to get aboard. I just jumped aboard. Thank God.
The effectiveness of the Luftwaffe was restricted. The bombers could not operate at night. Visibility was limited by frequent mists, although calm seas favoured the evacuation fleet, and the Royal Air Force could sufficiently harass German aircraft to restrict their effect. By the end of Operation Dynamo, the RAF had lost 177 aircraft, the Germans 240. Had the Germans not halted on the 23rd, it is unlikely that such an evacuation could have been conducted.
The evacuation of Dunkirk means several things. I mean, in sheer practical terms, it means that the British have literally hundreds of thousands of men to continue the fight. Secondly, they've got not just British troops, but French troops especially. So there's a free French army created in Britain because of the evacuation of Dunkirk.
Though the British troops had lost their equipment, they had boosted morale and the will to resist.
Anyway, the BEF has come back, and whatever the disasters that have led to their return, we at home are mighty glad to have them here.
And when, on their return, Churchill made his defiant "we shall fight on the beaches, we shall never surrender" speech, he spoke for the nation.
It's an enormous psychological boost. I mean, we still talk about the Dunkirk spirit, because although it was a massive defeat, it was a psychological victory which the British drew on for the rest of the war.
In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China. It did not go to plan. Progress was slow, resistance more stubborn than had been anticipated. In 1939, Japanese colonial ambitions suffered a further check on the Mongolian border, where Soviet troops inflicted a decisive defeat. It all strengthened the hand of that faction in the military, which argued that Japan's expansion should be south. To Japan, it was the southern resources area, and dressed up as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, it would give Japan all of the living space and raw material that she needed.
What we need to remember here is that this is an age largely before synthetic products. That Japan had been fighting a very costly war in China. The way that it saw finishing that war was it needed more resources. The Japanese leadership saw that they had no choice but to seize the resources of the Netherlands East Indies.
Not only are the Dutch East Indies of great strategic value, but also they contain great material wealth. Oil, for instance.
Their aims were to do it quickly so they could release the troops needed to send them back to fight the war in China, so that they could grab those resources in the Netherlands East Indies and start shipping them back to Japan before the United States started to gear up for war.
December 7th, 1941. As Japanese aircraft were approaching Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces under General Tomoyuki Yamashita were already going ashore on the Malay Peninsula at Kota Baru.
Some of their early successes were all about simultaneous operations across a broad swathe of Asia and the Pacific. So the British and American forces in the Asia Pacific, they were spread out trying to react to the Japanese. A lot of these places were very weakly garrisoned as well, so the Japanese were very quickly seizing them and then moving on, because part of their battle plans were that troops required for one operation were then moved relatively quickly on to the next. So they didn't have time to do that.
At the end of 1941, hardly more than 3 weeks after the code words Tora 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 had sent in the raid on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese were now poised for a full-scale invasion of Burma, the conquest of the Philippines, the assault on Singapore, and the defeat of the Dutch in the resource-rich Dutch East Indies. As Churchill said of the fall of France, how could it have happened so quickly? The reasons for victory can be seen in the campaign in Malaya. They were repeated through the co-prosperity sphere and were fundamental to Japan's early success. When Japanese transports, more than 20 of them, brought Yamashita's army group ashore at 7 sites on December 8th, they were virtually unopposed. British forces were in their habitual deployment, particularly in strength around the Butterworth base, and had not been moved despite the growing threat of Japanese militarism and the presence of the Japanese force across the Gulf of Siam. The 5th Infantry Division quickly secured the air bases at Patani and Singora. Taking Singora, where the peninsula narrows, made possible the movement of Japanese forces across to the west coast. And that meant that Yamashita could advance on 2 fronts, dividing the defenders. The Japanese maintained flexibility in action. The east coast, thinly defended, was little more than a march southwards. The west coast required different tactics, and they got them. Hook actions either left strong defensive positions impotent in the wake of troops that had bypassed them, or more usually, encircled and smashed them. In places, these hooks meant moving through jungle that the British had deemed impassable, an echo of the French mistake that was exposed by the advance through the Ardennes.
The terrain is exploited by the Japanese in a way that it's not by the British. They never quite managed to work out how to prevent the Japanese outflanking, both using the forested areas, but also what the Japanese do in Malaya as well is make use of small craft to outflank British positions on the land by outflanking movements using the sea.
All the early reports from Malaya spoke of heavy and confused fighting with the Japanese gaining ground. This is typical Malayan country, almost the only place in which troops can deploy being the plantation.
The Japanese had been specifically trained in jungle warfare. The British and Commonwealth forces had not. Their strategy had suffered from traditional textbook planning which had, in a way, suffered from imperial hubris.
There's a lot of racial prejudice underlies the Allies' initial reading of what the Japanese military is capable of. And so it underestimates its ability to manoeuvre. It underestimates its ability to fight. It underestimates its willingness to utilise the terrain to its advantages. It underestimates the capabilities of its aircraft, and thus the Japanese are able to wrest control of the skies in areas that they're fighting very quickly.
Speed was fundamental to Japanese military thinking, so it was engineered into every aspect of the operation. Troops, not only in the Malay campaign, but everywhere and throughout the war, travelled with very little in the way of support. When, by the 21st of December, British formations received the order to concentrate on a line behind the Perak River, it was too late. Japan would continue to record victories, pushing and pushing faster than their opponents could recover, so that Singapore, the Philippines, and the East Indies would all fall. If there was a true blitzkrieg in the Second World War, it was this one. In a matter of weeks, Japan had gained for itself 1/6 of the surface of the planet.
It seems for a while that you have this superhuman enemy, this soldier who can keep going and going, who fights like the devil, who doesn't fight the way that Western forces expect to fight. It also means that there's a vast amount of territory that, if the Allies are going to win the war, that they have to recapture from the Japanese.
But after 6 months, the seeming invincibility of Japan was stopped in a great naval battle in a place called Midway. The United Kingdom's position as a great power, which she possessed at the start of the Second World War, was not a consequence of the wealth or weather or natural resources of the British Isles. It rested on her empire, a vast maritime empire, the greatest the world had known. And the integrity of that empire rested not on a large standing army, it depended on the Royal Navy.
The Royal Navy, facing only Germany before the fall of France, was a dominant force and continued to have the strategic advantage of effectively sitting astride Germany's exits to the globe.
It had 8 major groups located in the Atlantic at the time that the Germans could barely deploy 2 battle cruisers and a number of submarines.
Before the war began, the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee sailed for the South Atlantic, and there she waited.
Chief interest, of course, attaches to the famous pocket battleships, which are only 10,000 tons, but mount 6 11-inch guns and have a speed of 26 knots.
Once war had started, the Graf Spee began her operations. Between the end of September and the end of October, she sank 6 vessels in an area that straddled a major sea lane for ships, travelling around the Cape of Good Hope.
Well, the Graf Spee was in the South Atlantic as part of a deliberate campaign to interrupt, to destroy the global shipping movements, to slow and interrupt the movement of resources to and from the United Kingdom.
By November, the Royal Navy had formed 6 task forces to find and sink the battleship. In early December, Graf Spee claimed 2 more victims, but they did not go down without sending radio signals that influenced Commodore Harwood, commanding Force G, to concentrate his forces on the Falkland Islands. Captain Langsdorff, commanding Graf Spee, made 2 blunders. The first was that, spotting the smoke of 4 of Harwood's cruisers and mistaking them for destroyers on escort duty, he closed to the attack. What followed, history knows as the Battle of the River Plate.
Captain Langsdorff of the Graf Spee, it was his duty not to engage British warships. It was his duty to preserve that ship undamaged. As soon as he detected British ships, he should have tried to go in the opposite direction.
Langsdorff engaged Exeter and Ajax, Royal Navy, and Achilles, Royal Navy, New Zealand Division. As soon as he realized his mistake, he sped towards the enemy to prevent them from outpacing him. Graf Spee had diesel engines, the British vessels steam, which could not accelerate rapidly. Graf Spee engaged Exeter at 17,000 meters at 0618. She had turned northwest against the Germans' approach.
Hull would actually split the cruisers, so they came at Langsdorff from two directions, which unnerved him a bit.
Ajax and Achilles, turning together northeast, forced Langsdorff to spread his fire. After 2 minutes, Exeter was returning fire, but Graf Spee had far superior weaponry.
In fact, it inflicted quite significant damage on the three British cruisers, which were undergunned compared to the 11-inch guns that he had. They had 8 and 6-inch guns.
By 0630, Ajax and Achilles had closed to 12,000 meters, forcing the German gunners to divide their main armament. After nearly an hour, Admiral Graf Spee was finished, far from out of the fight, still sailing and seaworthy, but done for, because a shell from Exeter, herself badly damaged and soon to retire from the battle, had damaged the battleship's fuel plant. Graf Spee now had fuel for only 16 hours sailing, which meant she could not get home. Neither could the damage be repaired at sea. Langsdorff consulted the charts. He would head for the nearest neutral port, and that was Montevideo at the mouth of the River Plate.
There she is, the Admiral Graf Spee, in Montevideo Harbour, where she took refuge after the hammering she received from her small adversary.
In Montevideo, Langsdorff released the 61 British merchant seamen he had taken on board as survivors of vessels he had sunk, and sought permission to remain in port long enough to make repairs. The British had only one further vessel close enough to blockade Graf Spee. But that's not what they broadcast. False intelligence painted a picture of Force H, a large British force including the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, assembling to finish the German the moment she sailed from port. Langsdorff committed his second blunder. He believed the false intelligence.
He did have an idea that there were stronger forces waiting for him than were in fact the case. But it is true, given the damage he'd already had in the first action, that the Graf Spee, immediately leaving Montevideo, would have been forced into another action and would have received further damage, which would have left her, in my view, absolutely open to being hunted down and destroyed by the much more powerful forces that were concentrating on the River Plate at that time.
On December 17th, facing limited choices, he sailed his ship into the estuary and ordered it scuttled.
Tremendous explosions aft have wrecked the vessel, and there she lies, abandoned to the flames by captain and crew. Not to be sunk in open fight by the enemy, not to go down with her colours flying like the Rawalpindi, but to be blown up, abandoned, scuttled, in an act of defeatism which has rightly earned the contempt of all decent people.
2 days later, Hans Langsdorff shot himself. Even as an army marches to certain victory, a wrong step can lead to a setback, a defeat. The Allies had been grinding on from their Normandy beachhead, moving north and east, pushing the Germans back and approaching slowly against resistance towards the Rhine and the moment when they would set foot on German soil.
Market Garden is a bizarre battle because it arises from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's desire to bolt into Germany. Field Marshal Montgomery, the British commander, and Dwight Eisenhower, the American Supreme Commander, had a very uneasy relationship. They had fundamentally different ways of commanding, of projecting themselves. and they disagreed about the strategy for the Allied advance into Germany, which they had to do in order to defeat the Third Reich. Eisenhower, I think sensibly, wanted to advance on a broad front. Montgomery had a bizarre idea to punch a hole in the German defences, to break into the North German plain.
Montgomery hoped his plan might also answer those critics of his conduct following D-Day, when some had thought him overly cautious. Operation Market Garden was not a cautious plan, and following Eisenhower's approval, he received the troops and resources that he needed.
The new move was shaping up, and everybody knew it was to be another of those combined operations. And it was going to be that knockout punch we'd all been sweating out.
Market Garden's basically two operations. Market is the airborne operation, where they drop airborne troops beyond the bridges. Garden is the land advance to join up with those airborne forces. And it sounds like a sensible idea, except, as the phrase goes, it was a bridge too far.
For Montgomery's plan to work, it was essential that every phase of the operation was a success. Every bridge secured. Douglas C-47 aircraft, Dakotas to the British, were the workhorses of the operation. They carried the 1st Allied Airborne Army, and they towed the gliders. About 2,000 aircraft of various types were involved. Troops dropped in by glider or chute were to grasp and secure the bridges. Following them would be the British 30th Corps under General Brian Horrocks. If Horrocks could bring his men up in time, if the airborne divisions could take and hold the bridges until 30th Corps got through, the German flank would be turned on the Rhine. If. On September 17th, the operation was launched.
Then we were over the DZ, and it was red on, stand up, hook up, green on, go, and out we went. Feet together, head down, shoulders round, feet together, watch the ground, bump, that was it.
101st Airborne quickly secured the canal bridges. 82nd took Grava, but was forced back from Nijmegen by a strong counterattack. But on the 18th, 30th Corps linked with the 101st. And the next day, supporting the 82nd, renewed pressure on the bridge at Nijmegen. The bridge fell to them, and Operation Market had succeeded. The British 1st Airborne had achieved its initial objective on the first day, the 17th. Both paratroop and glider units were well grouped, and after a hard fight, the bridge over the Rhine was secured. 3 battalions made north, centre and southerly advances, but only 2nd Battalion in the south had reached its final objective on the northern approaches of the bridge. And there, it stuck. The bridge was a long way ahead of 30th Corps. A bridge too far, in fact, unless German resistance was moderate. It wasn't.
By this stage of the war, the Western Allies have got almost total command of the German secret intelligence. They're reading German messages virtually as soon as they're sent. What they did know, but what wasn't passed on to the troops who were responsible for actually carrying out this operation, was that in exactly the place where the paratroops were to be dropped, there was a German panzer division resting and re-equipping. So they literally dropped the 1st Allied Airborne Army onto the top of a German SS panzer division.
And that's where things started to unravel, for they were strong units. They were the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, and they pressed on the British bridgehead with superior numbers and weaponry. On the 21st, the Polish Brigade was dropped south of the Rhine. They had been delayed in joining the battle by bad weather, and poor intelligence dropped them into strong German positions where, instead of being able to force a way through to reinforce 1st Airborne, they were cut to pieces.
Airborne troops are, comparatively speaking, only lightly armed,
and landing behind the enemy's lines, they faced the prospect of engaging fully equipped, heavily armed forces, thus all the hazards of an isolated operation.
Further compounding 1st Airborne's situation was the loss of their drop zones. Malfunctioning radios made it almost impossible to advise the RAF of this. And consequently, vital resupply fell into the wrong hands. Of 390 tons of supplies dropped, only 31 tons were received by the British division.
We went in there on Sunday and fought from there until Wednesday afternoon. And there weren't many of us left then, and ammunition was pretty well non-existent.
General Urquhart, commanding 1st Airborne, made the decision to pull his men to a defensible position to await relief by the overdue 30th Corps. This meant abandoning 2nd Battalion, which had reached the northern end of the bridge. German troops, meanwhile, cut across the British line of advance south of Uden, further slowing the relieving column. On the 26th, 9 days after the drop, 30th finally linked up with 1st Airborne, but it was too late to effect a battle that had been lost.
Market Garden is an absurd Allied defeat at the very moment where the Allies are gloriously advancing through France and Belgium, liberating the country as they go. It should never have happened. The Allies are massively well equipped, they've got more weapons, more equipment, more intelligence than the Germans, but they fail to use it.
Of 10,000 who had landed at Arnhem, 2,000 marched out with 30th Corps. Most of the rest saw out the remainder of the war as prisoners of the Germans.
Market Garden certainly doesn't do Montgomery's reputation any good. Eisenhower already knows that he's a hard man to work with, and Market Garden puts the cap on it. It has another effect, of course, and that is that the Allies are not going to get to the Maas and certainly not going to cross the Rhine in 1944. And of course it means that Eisenhower's actually right, that you can't simply drive your column into North Germany and expect to win. You've got to advance on a broad front, and that's exactly what the Allies do in 1945, and that's what gets the Germans defeated in the West.
The overwhelming size of significant actions, like the landings at Normandy or Japan's epic sweep through the Asia-Pacific region, dominate our view of war, distracting us from campaigns unfairly referred to as sideshows. But some sideshows have real strategic significance, and all of them involve real fighting, real destruction, real death. In the wash-up from the First World War, Britain and France, then the possessors of the world's two great maritime empires, had divided the Middle East between them. With the fall of France, the collaborationist government was allowed to retain control of French colonies. So it was that opposing forces faced each other across the desert frontier.
French standards, symbolic of the nation's honor, sailed for safekeeping in French African territory.
France had carved out Lebanon and Syria, both guarding the eastern Mediterranean and Syrian astride routes into Iran, then Persia, a major source of vital oil. And neighboring the British sphere of influence in Iraq, where rebellion against the British had only been curbed in May. On June 8th, a joint British, Commonwealth and Free French force moved into Lebanon and Syria with the expectation that the 45,000-strong Vichy French garrison would surrender and march over to the Allied cause. But it did not, and 6 weeks of fierce fighting ensued before the Vichy French lost the battle. And 6,000 were counted as casualties. The Vichy French resisted skillfully along all three of the Allied routes of advance. On the coastal sector, fierce fighting occurred at the Litani River on the 9th of June, and on the 12th of June it was decided to transfer the bulk of the forces to the coastal advance, where good progress was being made by the 10th Indian Division and Free French forces. Much of the Vichy force comprised French colonial troops.
The Vichy troops dug themselves in well at all points, often holding fire to point-blank range. But this only made our fellows all the more determined to finish off the job.
When Australian James Heather Gordon charged a machine gun emplacement during the Battle of Iwo Jima, an action for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross, he found that he had been fighting not Frenchmen, but Senegalese. The Allied advance stalled on Jebel Abu Atris, where a flanking move by Free French tanks was stopped by heavy shelling from Vichy artillery. And troops holding Quneitra on the other main road to Damascus reported the approach of a strong Vichy force from the north. 2 companies of Free French troops were sent to reinforce defensive positions across the road. By 0900 on the 15th of June, Indian troops were pushing forward into the hills and within an hour had captured Tel Kisue. By 11:30, Free French Marines had secured the village of Montkelbey. In the second phase of the attack, Free French were fighting Vichy French. The very tragedy that General de Gaulle had wanted to avoid at Dakar.
What a comment on the so-called honor of the Vichy leaders that they should have ordered their men to fight not only their former British allies, but even the Free French, their own countrymen.
During the night of the 15th of June, Indian troops took R2s on the Quneitra to Damascus road, cutting the communications of the Vichy force advancing on Quneitra. But their approach was too slow. On the afternoon of the 16th of June, the Allies at Quneitra, outnumbered 3-1 and facing tanks against which they had no effective counter, surrendered. But by the 18th of June, the situation had been restored. Allied focus switched to Damascus, which fell on the 21st of June. On that day, a mixed force of British troops, including those of the Arab Legion, entered Syria from Iraq and advanced on Palmyra, which was attacked on the 25th of June. The Vichy forces held out for 9 days before surrendering.
Finally, the entry into Damascus. You could hardly say the population looked gloomy about our arrival, could you?
After the capture of Damascus, the drive on Beirut, chiefly the Australian 7th Division, became the main Allied focus. On the 10th of July, the Australians were within 10 kilometres of Beirut. The British 4th Cavalry Brigade was closing on Homs, and the 10th Indian Division was advancing into northern Syria.
Of course, the importance of our occupation of Syria hardly needs stressing. Success in Syria justifies us in chalking one more mark against Hitler.
The Vichy French commander, General Henry Dentz, sought an armistice. He had lost the battle, and his command of 38,000 surviving troops was given the option to be returned to Vichy France or to join the Free French forces. Less than 6,000 elected to join the Free French. That mattered less than the control that Britain now had in the Middle East. The Eastern Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, and the Arab oil fields were all more defensible because of the sideshow in Syria. On the 25th of April 1945, American and Soviet troops made contact.
The link-up between the Americans and the Russians at the River Elbe near Torgau marked the climax of the 2 great advances into the heart of Germany from west and east. It was colossal news.
On the same day, the Red Army completed its encirclement of Berlin.
Berlin, at the same time, became a fortress city. That was the special concept, meaning that the city was to be defended at all costs, to the last cartridge, to the last bullet, to the last man.
Defensive preparations were made in depth, but resources were far from elite.
The numbers in Berlin, well, there are no concrete numbers. Mostly it was a mishmash of units, so police units, Hitler Youth units, and Volkssturm units, just people's militia, made of those who were not able to serve in the regular army because they were either too young or too old or had some sicknesses, health issues, pretty much everything they could get.
The 12th Army, west of the city, comprised 12 divisions that were a grab bag of raw recruits. Von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army, north of the city, comprised 9 divisions, none of which was panzer. The total deployed in defense of the capital was some 50 in different divisions. Coming towards them were almost 200 divisions of the Red Army. And as they came, they scorched the earth. The Soviet offensive was designed to ensure the fall of Berlin no later than May Day, May the 1st. Soviet forces began to move on April the 12th. Air raids continued to pummel the city.
The Berliners, they built tram barricades, piles of rubble to block the streets, but how could that help really? Because 7 Soviet armies were advancing exactly on Berlin, and the Berlin garrison had less than 100,000 men. This is less than a corps against 7 Soviet full able-bodied armies. So their situation was dire, to say the least.
Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front in the center, Konev's 1st Ukrainian front to his south. Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian to his north would race each other for the prize. On April 16th, Zhukov's offensive began when 3 red flares shot skywards and 140 searchlights were turned on in the eyes of the enemy. Then 3 green flares signaled the start of a ground-shattering bombardment. Literally so shocking that entire villages collapsed and whole forests exploded as 8,983 Soviet guns opened up. The bombardment lasted for 35 minutes. Then, abruptly, neatly, it stopped. And the Red Army moved forward, more than 6 million men and women with one thing in mind. Zhukov, advancing from his bridgehead on the Oder, was aiming for the heart of the city.
The Germans, mostly the SS units, they were tough in battle, but nothing could save them. This is obvious, because the Soviet soldiers, they were so close to the victory that they were waiting for, fighting for, hoping for 4 years. Now, there is a moment of revenge, especially for those who lost their loved ones or who went through the occupied territories in the Soviet Union and saw the horrible massacres and all the outcomes of the genocidal policy that the German state was executing in the occupied Eastern territories. So now they were fighting with even more rage, more anger.
Retribution is incidental in the course of military operations, but certainly here in Berlin there was all the evidence of it. Retribution for the havoc caused by Hitler's Huns in Leningrad and Warsaw, London, Coventry, Rotterdam, and all the devastated cities of the Allies.
On the 26th, the city center was ringed, and Soviet forces advancing house to house, room to room, moved in. Their objective was the Reichstag.
Въехал в Берлин. Ну, в Берлине воевали сложно было, конечно. Мы прорывались к Рейхстагу, помогали пехоте туда продвигаться, пробивались, и везде это. Нас тоже много подожгли, наших машин много. Я как-то остался, вроде ничего.
Berlin was hell, pretty much. This was hell. A number of those who fought, they remember that it was hard to tell if it was night or day, because thick black smoke was covering the sunlight. The smoke that was lit by the fires of knocked out tanks and buildings, screams in the air, screams of those wounded, because Berlin was full of civilians that, of course, were dying during the course of the battle. And dust from the destroyed buildings was always in the air. It was hard to breathe all the time. It cracked on the teeth of those who fought.
On April 30th, after first successfully testing the poison on his beloved dog Blondie, Hitler and his new bride bit down on cyanide capsules, at which point Hitler, to be certain, shot himself in the temple. The Red Army was 200 meters away. The next day, the Reichstag fell, and the red flag was famously hoisted on its roof. General Helmut Weidling, commanding the military garrison, surrendered the city.
Berlin as a capital, as a city even, was dead. This was what remained of the Reichstag, the building which gained worldwide notoriety when the Nazis seized power.
Дальше картинка сразу. Берлин преобразился. Покрылся белым цветом. Из окон, балконов, где только можно, белые полотнища. Простыни, наволочки, что угодно белое было, вывешивали. Берлинское население, не подтверждало, само капитулировало, сообщало о своей безоговорочной капитуляции.
The battle for the capital had cost more than 300,000 Soviet casualties, perhaps a similar number of German casualties, and in addition 480,000 German prisoners who had failed in their attempt to break out west to surrender to the American, British and French forces from whom they expected kinder treatment.
The capital has fallen, but the resistance still was going in the north. Some troops were still fighting for the Third Empire that did not exist, that lasted for only 12 years. The last of the last, they just decided to give themselves in late May 1945. This was the end of the Reich.